I guess the two golden rules of doing a presentation is one, have a typo on the first slide so you can break the ice. So we've done that. I'm actually not Shahar. Our CEO was not able to come today, so I apologize. And the second one is follow up a presenter who starts by making the case for you such that you can go deep dive on one of the components that we talked about. So Shai talked a lot about the evolution. I'm going to go and talk about what Gett thinks is the taxi car on demand to spur the fuel consumption revolution. And what do I mean by that? So we all talked about it, and Shai talked about it, made a very, very eloquent point about how private cars are an extraordinarily poorly utilized assets. So we're putting a more of a graphic way, illustration around it. Let's just assume that you're taking 2 trips a day. The first trip is the one to work, the second one is the one back from work. Each one of them takes about 30 minutes. That's about 4% utilization on the asset itself. 23 hours of the day, that asset that you paid a pretty nice sum of money for sits idly either in a parking space by your house doing nothing. 4% is the time that it's utilized. We actually think that 4% is an optimistic view of the world. What do we mean by that? The airline industry that Shai talked about views utilization not on an asset basis, but on a seat mile basis. What does that mean? There are 5 seats in an average car. The utilization would be the number of seats that are occupied on a per mile basis. So take on the left hand here the 4% utilization of the car, of the asset, which is 4%, and then multiply it by the number of passengers in a car, 1.5 average for divided by 5 seats, and you get a utilization of 1.3%. You don't have too many assets in the world to get utilized 1% of the time. Well, what does that mean from a fuel consumption standpoint, which is why everybody came here today? Poor utilization is one of the main drivers of global fuel consumption. 10 trillion miles are being driven per year. 10 trillion miles. That, based on what Morgan Stanley says, is 108,000 times trips from the Earth to the sun and back per year. 10 trillion miles per year. That translates into 500 billion gallons of fuel consumed per year and 1.5 trillion in total fuel costs. Now, these are really, really, really large numbers compared to anything, any industry, any numbers, any economy. We think the taxi car on demand can dramatically reduce fuel consumption, and Shai was talking about huge revolutions that will take quicker than anybody thinks, but we think that, the revolution has actually started and it's going on. I'm going to put some numbers against it. The 3 key drivers of why we're going to reduce fuel consumption dramatically are: 1, much higher utilization of the actual asset. 2, it's a shift from cars to seat miles, which would improve the utilization even further. And the third one is much, much, much greater adoption of electric vehicles, because taxi cars on demand have a much greater incentive to actually move away from fuel consumption than the private car owner. So let's take these one by one. Okay, we've already improved utilization about 10 times. What do we mean by that? On the left-hand side, private cars at a utilization of 4%. Taxis that are not on demand, meaning dispatched on the street, yellow taxis in New York, so on and so forth, are utilized roughly 25% of the time. What does that mean? 25% of the time they have a paying customer within the car riding in that taxi. Now, Gett and others are doing average of 40%. We're higher in some markets, Tel Aviv, for example, but an average 40%. So all of a sudden, you've improved utilization already of your asset by 10x. Now, we're shooting for much, much higher aspiration in the future, 70%, and we're well on our way there. So that's kind of the first step. The first step is the utilization of the actual asset. But we said, utilization of the actual asset is not what matters the most here. Taxi pooling, meaning getting more people in an on-demand car, not just one single individual, will further improve seat mile efficiency. Private car with 1.5 people in it, taxi pooling, let's assume that there's the driver plus 4 passengers in it, then again, you've increased your utilization on a seat mile basis by quite a bit. Let's take these two and combine them into some math. Private car on the top, 4% car utilization times 1.5 average customers, 1.3%. We talked about that. At the bottom, 40% of the asset utilization times 4 out of 5 seat miles utilized, 32%. You've reached a 25 5x multiplier, and that is before you've even reached 70% utilization and so on and so forth, and not even talking about vehicles that have more than 5 seats in them that can carry more than 4 people in them with a driver. But what does that all mean from a practical standpoint? Shai was talking about how the industry has started evolving. 2009, the industry did not exist, the industry of on-demand. In 2015, 6 million rides per day were being done on demand. Now, it sounds like a huge number, but remember, there are 1.1 billion cars globally. Let's take 2 trips per each one of those cars, and you get to more than 2 billion trips per day. So it's 6 million out of 2 billion, still a tiny number, right? What does it mean? Does it even move the needle? In 2016, though, if you look at the 6 million of 2015, we're already at higher than 25 million. And by the way, since we first put this slide together, we had to update that number twice because the growth is exponential. Now take that growth, exponential growth, and multiply it to 2025, and by the year 2025, we're assuming that the number of miles that are going to be driven on demand are going to be the same as the number of miles that are going to be driven by private cars. Now, is it 2025, 2023, whatever that, it doesn't really matter. That evolution is moving very, very, very fast. So far, it's been done alongside car ownership, not to replace it. Now, autonomous cars is obviously the next taxi car on demand growth engine. Let's use the same kind of timeline with the same rough years. 2009, science fiction. You see it in movies, people talk about it, but it's people who are, very extreme engineers who specialize in this field, not really anything that's evident. 2016, now, hundreds of millions of miles have been by now driven in an autonomous way, either in a semi-autopilot, fully autonomous, whatever type of combination, but huge growth in just 7 years. And 2020 consensus is that they're going to be ready for production, and by 2030, half of the cars that are going to be sold are going to be at least partially autonomous. So that is going to be the next growth engine for taxi car on demand by reducing costs, by making the cost of the actual ride be a whole lot more affordable, shifting more people into that industry, into our industry. Now, electric vehicles on demand will obviously further reduce fuel consumption. The reason why they would do that in an accelerated fashion with on demand is because on demand is utilized 10x, 25x, whatever the number is, more than the private car. So there's much, much greater incentive for a driver of an on-demand vehicle or a fleet or a taxi car operator to shift away to electric car vehicles. Actually a 10x if you look at the 40% utilization versus a 4% utilization. Again, is it a 10x incentive or a 20x incentive? It doesn't really matter. There's a huge incentive to move away from fuel-consuming cars to cars that are electric and do not have the same huge cost basis, $4,000 on average for a car operated full-time. Obviously, many additional other benefits, less need for parking spaces, lower insurance costs, less accidents. All of these have, each and every one of these have huge, huge, huge implications on global economy. Each of these are just additional accelerators that will drive the adoption of on-demand taxi rides. So what does it all kind of add up to if you sum it all up? On the left-hand side, you have kind of the grim situation of it today. 500 billion gallons consumed a year at 1.3% utilization. Taxi car on demand, taxi pooling, huge acceleration, electric vehicles, autonomous cars, so on and so forth. And the question that we pose here is, how low can we go? Is it going to go down to 0? Is it going to go down to, it's going to go down a whole lot lower than where it is today. And all we can say is, we are all in. And we're committed to do everything that we can to take our part in kind of that sliding scale to get us off of $500 billion of gallons consumed to a number that's a whole lot smaller than that. Thank you very much.